When we think about World War I, our collective memory immediately goes to a very specific, very gray place. We think of the Western Front. We imagine the endless mud of Flanders, the rats in the trenches, the barbed wire of the Somme, and the industrial meat grinder of Verdun. We think of a war that was static, depressing, and defined by inches. But while the world was watching Europe burn, a completely different war was happening 4,000 miles away. And honestly, it was a war that felt like it was written by a comedy writer with a dark sense of humor. This was the East African Campaign. It was a war fought not over inches of mud, but across a territory twice the size of Germany. It was a war fought in jungles, savannas, and deserts. It was a war where soldiers were more likely to be killed by a lion, a hippo, or a mosquito than by an enemy bullet. And right at the start of this campaign, in November 1914, there occurred a battle so disastrous, so bizarre, and so humiliating for the British Empire that for decades they tried to pretend it never happened. It wasn't decided by heavy artillery. It wasn't decided by brilliant flanking maneuvers. It was decided by incompetence. Arrogance, and I am not making this up, the tactical intervention of millions of angry African killer bees. This is the story of the Battle of Tanga, a story about how a ragtag group of Germans and Askari warriors embarrassed the greatest empire on earth and how nature itself decided to pick a side. To understand why this happened, we have to look at the map of 1914. The scramble for Africa had turned the continent into a patchwork quilt of European colonies. On the east coast, you had German East Africa, what is today Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. It was the jewel of the German colonial empire, massive, resource-rich, and wild. Directly to the north lay British East Africa, or modern-day Kenya. Now, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand got shot in Sarajevo and the dominoes of war started falling in Europe, the colonial governors in Africa actually tried to stay out of it. There was a treaty, the Congo Act of 1885, which technically said that African colonies should remain neutral even if their mother countries were fighting in Europe. The governors on both sides effectively said, "Look, it's hot, we're far away, let's just not do this." But in London, the British High Command had other ideas. They looked at the map and saw a big German blob in the middle of their pink empire. They controlled the sea with the Royal Navy. They had the massive manpower of the Indian Army. They thought, this will be a cakewalk. We'll just sail down there, knock on the door, and the Germans will surrender. It'll be a nice Christmas present for King George. They viewed the East African theater as a sideshow, a cleanup operation. But they forgot one thing. They forgot to check who was in charge of the German forces. Enter the protagonist of our story, or the villain, depending on who you ask, Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Vorbeck was the definition of a Prussian soldier, tough, scarred, disciplined, and incredibly intelligent. He had served in China during the Boxer Rebellion and in German Southwest Africa. He was a man who understood something that the British didn't: asymmetric warfare. Vorbeck knew he couldn't win. He was cut off from Germany. The British Royal Navy blockaded the ocean. He had no way to get reinforcements, no way to get more ammo, and he was outnumbered 10-1. Most commanders would have surrendered to save lives, but Vorbeck was rebel. He actually received orders from Berlin telling him not to fight. They told him to stay neutral. Vorbeck ignored the telegram. He effectively ghosted the Kaiser. His philosophy was simple but brutal. I cannot win in Africa, but if I can be annoying enough, if I can attack railways and forts and run away, the British will have to send thousands of soldiers to catch me. And every British soldier chasing me through the jungle is one less British soldier fighting Germans in France. He commanded the Schutztruppe, the protection force. This was a small unit of German officers and about 2,500 Askaris. The Askaris were local African soldiers fighting for Germany, and the British made the fatal mistake of underestimating them. The British viewed the Askaris as untrained militia. In reality, under Vorbeck, they were some of the toughest, most disciplined, and deadliest guerrilla fighters on the planet. They could march 30 miles a day on a handful of rice, they knew the terrain, and they were fiercely loyal to Vorbeck. Vorbeck was ready to play cat and mouse, but the British were about to walk into the lion's den. Representing the British Empire, we have Major General Arthur Aitken. If Vorbeck was a modern tactical genius, Aitken was a relic of the Victorian era. He was a man who believed in the stiff upper lip and the inherent superiority of the British officer class. He was given command of Indian Expeditionary Force B. This was a massive invasion force of 8,000 men. It included British regulars and thousands of troops from the British Indian Army regiments like the Kashmir Rifles and the North Lancashire Regiment. On paper, this force was terrifying. In reality, it was a mess. Most of the Indian troops had never fought in a war before. They hadn't trained together. They didn't speak the same languages, and crucially, they had never been trained for bush warfare. They were trained to fight in the open plains of India, not the dense, suffocating mangrove swamps of East Africa. Aitken didn't care. He was frighteningly overconfident. He famously said, "The German army is ill-equipped, lacks morale, and will surrender as soon as they see us." He despised his own Indian troops, trusting only the white British officers, and he refused to listen to any intelligence reports that suggested the Germans might actually put up a fight. His target was Tanga. Tanga was a vital port city. It was the ocean terminal for the Uzambara Railway. If you take Tanga, you control the flow of supplies inland. So in October 1914, Aitken loads his 8,000 men onto ships in Bombay and sets sail. The voyage takes weeks. It is a disaster. The ships are overcrowded. There is no ventilation. The food goes bad. The soldiers, thousands of men packed like sardines, get horribly seasick. Dysentery breaks out. By the time the fleet arrives off the coast of East Africa, Force B isn't a fighting force. It's a floating hospital of exhausted, sick, and demoralized men. It is November 2nd, 1914. The British fleet arrives at Tanga. Now, usually when you launch an amphibious invasion, you want the element of surprise. You want to storm the beaches at dawn before the enemy wakes up, but General Aitken and the Royal Navy decided to be gentlemen. The British cruiser HMS Fox sails into the harbor ahead of the troop transports. It doesn't fire its guns. It doesn't drop commandos. Instead, the captain lowers a small boat, rows ashore, and knocks on the front door of the local German district commissioner, a guy named Orasher. The British captain essentially says, "Good morning, we have a massive army just over the horizon. We are here to conquer you. Would you mind surrendering? It would save us a lot of paperwork." Commissioner Orasher, who must have been sweating bullets but kept a poker face, played the bluff of the century. He said, "Oh goodness, well, I am just a civil servant. I need to ask my superior officer for permission to surrender. He is out of town. Give me a little time." The British captain says, "Splendid, take your time, old chap, we'll just wait here." The British sail back to their ships. The truce is on. Of course, Orasher didn't ask for permission to surrender. He ran to the telegraph office and sent an urgent wire to Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. "British fleet at Tanga, send help immediately." Vorbeck was hundreds of miles away near Mount Kilimanjaro. He read the telegram, grabbed his troops, threw them onto trains, and barreled toward the coast. Meanwhile, General Aitken sat on his ship and waited. He waited for the surrender. He waited all day. He waited all night. By giving the Germans a 24-hour head start, he allowed Vorbeck to rush hundreds of elite soldiers into the town. They dug trenches, they set up machine gun nests, they cleared lines of fire. They turned the sleepy town of Tanga into a fortress. When the British finally realized on November 3rd that the Germans weren't going to surrender, the element of surprise was dead and buried. So the invasion is on. but Aitken, in his infinite wisdom, decides not to land directly at the town harbor. Instead, he chooses landing site a few miles down the coast, but because he was so arrogant, he hadn't bothered to scout the beach. The chosen landing zone was an environmental nightmare. It was a dense mangrove swamp. The water was shallow, meaning the transport boats couldn't get to the shore. The soldiers had to jump out into chest-deep water. Imagine this: you are a soldier from India. You have been seasick for 2 weeks, you are dehydrated, you are carrying a heavy rifle and 50 pounds of gear. You jump into the ocean and the water is slime. You have to wade for hundreds of yards through tangled roots. Leeches are attaching to your legs, mosquitoes are swarming your face. It took the British almost an entire day just to get the men onto dry land. By the time they formed up, they were shattered. They had no water, they had no food, and they were terrified. Aitken still didn't care. He assumed the Germans would run away at the first shot. He didn't even unload all the artillery or ammunition from the ships because he thought, why bother unloading it if we're just going to march into town and win? On the morning of November 4th, the march began. The British force, 8,000 strong, began to move through the thick coconut plantations and rubber trees toward Tanga. They were walking blind. They had no maps. Literally, the officers were using sketches they had drawn from looking at the shore through binoculars. They had no scouts, and waiting for them in the bush were Vorbeck's machine guns. The fighting started in the afternoon. It was brutal. The jungle was so thick that the British units lost contact with each other immediately. It became a confused brawl. The German Askaris opened fire with Maxim machine guns. The noise was deafening. The British Indian troops, many of whom were green recruits, panicked. They couldn't see where the fire was coming from. The smoke from the black powder rifles filled the air, making visibility zero. General Aitken, watching from the rear, refused to dig in. He ordered a frontal assault. Go forward, bayonets. The British North Lancashire Regiment and the Kashmir Rifles pushed hard. They actually managed to break into the town of Tanga. Brutal house-to-house fighting broke out. It looked for a moment like the sheer weight of British numbers would crush the tiny German force. But then the most bizarre event in military history occurred. The area around Tanga was filled with old, hollow baobab trees and logs. And inside these trees lived massive colonies of East African lowland honey bees. These are not the cute, fuzzy bees you see in a garden. These are the ancestors of what the Americans call killer bees. They are incredibly aggressive. They will chase a victim for half a mile. As the battle raged, thousands of bullets began ripping through the forest. Bullets slammed into the trees. Artillery shells shook the ground. The hives were destroyed. The bees were agitated. And suddenly millions of them poured out of the woodworks. The bees didn't have a flag. They didn't care about the Kaiser or the king. They just saw thousands of sweaty, screaming men destroying their homes. A massive, buzzing black cloud descended the battlefield. The effect was instantaneous. The firing stopped. Battle-hardened soldiers dropped their rifles and began doing a frantic dance, swatting at the air. Men were screaming not from bullet wounds, but from the agony of hundreds of stings on their faces, necks, and hands. The British took the brunt of it because they were moving through the bush. The 98th Infantry Regiment completely fell apart. Reports from the battle describe soldiers running in circles, rolling on the ground, and diving into the bushes to escape the swarm. The machine gun crews were hit the hardest. They couldn't let go of their guns, so they just sat there getting stung until they passed out or fled. One British engineer wrote, "We were attacked by swarms of bees." The result was that the firing died down on both sides, while every man was engaged in swatting the angry insects. It wasn't just the infantry. The HMS Fox, trying to help, fired its 6-inch guns into the town. One shell hit a massive beehive right next to the German hospital. The swarm invaded the hospital wards, stinging wounded soldiers and doctors alike. For about an hour, the Great War paused. It was replaced by the Great Bee War. The British assault line collapsed. The officers lost control. You can threaten a soldier with a court-martial if he runs from a German, but you can't reason with a man who has 50 bees inside his shirt. As the sun began to set, the bees settled down, but the damage was done. The British morale was shattered. They were thirsty, bleeding, stung, and facing an enemy that seemed to be in league with nature itself. Aitken was furious. He still refused to believe he was losing, but as night fell, the confusion got worse. In the dark, British units started shooting at each other. They mistook the rustling of palm trees for German attacks. Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, realizing the British were in chaos, launched a counterattack with his Askaris. They charged with bayonets, screaming war cries. Blowing bugles, the British Indian troops, already traumatized by the bees, broke and ran. It was a stampede back to the beaches. Aitken stood on the beach watching his army dissolve. He had 8,000 men, he had battleships, and he had been beaten by 1,000 men and a lot of bugs. He ordered the evacuation, but here is the final insult. In his panic to get away, Aitken ordered the troops to leave their equipment behind. He didn't want to waste time loading crates, so the British army boarded their rowboats and fled into the night. When the sun rose on November 5th, Vorbeck walked down to the beach. He expected to see the British preparing for another attack. Instead, he saw an empty beach. Well, not empty. It was covered in mountains of supplies. The British had left behind 16 modern Maxim machine guns, 455 modern rifles, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, telephone equipment, coats, uniforms, and canned food. Vorbeck picked up a British rifle, looked at the crates of ammo, and probably smiled. The British had just solved his supply problem for him. He had enough ammo now to fight for another year. They had essentially Amazon Prime delivered an entire war chest to the enemy they were trying to defeat. The Battle of Tanga was a total catastrophe for the British. They suffered 847 casualties. The Germans lost only 61 men, but the embarrassment was the real wound. When the news reached London, the government was mortified. They actually censored the newspapers. For months, the British public wasn't told the full story. When the story did leak, the press went into denial mode. They couldn't accept that they lost to a smaller force, so they blamed the bees. The British papers ran stories claiming that the Germans were diabolical. They claimed the Germans had rigged tripwires to the beehives. They claimed Vorbeck had trained the bees. Of course, this wasn't true. The Germans got stung too, but it was easier to believe in weaponized German bees than to admit that General Aitken was an idiot. General Aitken was recalled to London in disgrace. He was demoted to colonel and retired. He spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name, blaming his Indian troops, but history remembers him as the architect of the disaster. As for Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, this victory made him a legend. Using the guns and ammo he stole from the British at Tanga, he continued his guerrilla war for 4 more years. He led the British on a wild goose chase across Mozambique and Rhodesia. He famously never surrendered during the war. He was the only German commander to invade British soil and remain undefeated. He only laid down his arms on November 25, 1918, 2 weeks after the war had already ended in Europe, because he was so deep in the jungle he hadn't heard the news. The Battle of Tanga is a strange, funny, and tragic footnote in the history of World War I. It serves as a reminder that war isn't just about numbers or technology. It's about terrain, leadership, and luck. The British Empire was the most powerful force on Earth. They had the ships, the money, and the men. But on a hot day in November 1914, they were humbled. They were beaten by a clever German general who refused to follow rules. They were beaten by their own arrogance. And most importantly, they were beaten by the angry, buzzing guardians of the African forest. So the next time you hear someone talk about the sophisticated strategies of the Great War, just remember the time the British Army lost a fight to a swarm of bees.